Welcome to AI Talks, a place to come and listen to IBM customers, partners, and colleagues talk about the digital organization and how AI, hybrid cloud, and enterprise software is critical to success. Let me hand over to my colleagues to get us started. Welcome to AI Talks podcast. My name is Paul Russell, and I'm joined by my colleague Andy Stanford-Clark from IBM, and also Ved Sen from our great partner TCS. Ved, tell us a little bit about you and what your role is. And I suppose one kind of question to prompt you is what do you think for this year? What's your big, exciting technology that you're looking at?
No pressure.
So no pressure. And Andy, that means it's coming to you next as well.
I got it.
Thank you for the gentle start. Hi, my name is Ved, and I work as a digital evangelist as well as a business innovation lead for TCS in the UK. Fundamentally, that means being a dot connector of kind of finding really interesting technologies and ideas our colleagues are working on the one hand, and connecting them to client problems where we can go in and solve things, aided by a truly cross-functional, diverse team that acts as an innovation agency. But with that introduction, I think it also kind of harks to the 10 changes that we're having to go through organizationally. I mean, you guys at IBM have already been through kind of a transformation of sorts from being seen essentially as a hardware provider to essentially a software company and a data company today. And I think TCS has a similar transformation in play of going from an organization that is seen as an IT organization, essentially back office, to a company, because technology goes everywhere today. We are in a transformation as well ourselves to be a technology partner that will enable revenues, that will enable transformation and growth. Within that environment, I think there are lots of interesting areas that, to your question, we think are really fascinating for us to look at right now, because there are so many social, political changes that in turn drive a very fertile ground for technologies to come through. I personally think augmented reality is more of the day, but I'm sure VR kind of is not far behind that. It feels like we've been kind of on the verge of something great on AR as well for a long while now. But I do think that with both Google and Apple kind of embedding the AR engine into the operating system, we will now see a much higher uptake of AR because it's easier to produce them, it's easier to consume them, everybody has it. You don't have to download software, and the applications themselves become easier and lighter. And the last thing I think we are kind of in the middle of a massive transformation is healthcare. So there you've got things like bioelectronics and other areas which I think are fundamentally interesting from the way healthcare itself is going to be transformed between, let's say, over the next decade. Good start for us.
Ved, thank you. I think we're getting better understanding of why we need technology now, because we've now got clarity of the really important things, and you touched on healthcare there. So I think that will be a theme. So Andy, over to you, who you are, same kind of thing, and really obviously the thing you're looking forward to this year the most.
Thank you, Ved. Yeah, follow that. So I'm Andy Stanford-Clark. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for IBM UK and Ireland. I've been doing that role for 3 years. Before that, career in Internet of Things, going back 20 years. And in that role, I've covered a lot of the core technologies of Internet of Things, and also worked in some of the application areas like smarter cities, future energy grid, that kind of stuff. I think it's really interesting to hear Ved's views on what's going to be important this year. I'm particularly passionate about virtual reality. I will have an argument with you at some point about AR versus VR. But interestingly, VR has passed the dual tipping point of the headsets being affordable. They're hundreds rather than thousands of pounds, and you don't feel sick when you use them, which makes a huge difference. So I think that's going to be really huge across many applications, particularly as we're still not traveling. And the long-term effects of the pandemic are going to be felt through our business life. Meetings in VR become a thing, like it was back in Second Life 10 years ago when we were playing around in that. But mostly, I think I'd underline the spectrum of AI, everything from simple statistics through software modeling, digital twin, into advanced statistics, regression, classifiers, and then into the more human-like aspects of AI, like visual image processing, sound processing, things we normally attribute to human-like skills. That, rather than being, are you using AI or not, is really a continuum on which you can place yourself on a journey toward AI, of using advanced mathematics, or doing stuff with data, is what it all boils down to.
Both touched on is man and machines, which I know is a well-worn phrase. We are learning better about how man and machine can coexist. So Ved, kick off with you first. And I really think this, you alluded to about healthcare, social care, provision. What is the role of technology?
If you look at social care, Paul, it's kind of a poor cousin of healthcare. in that it is less digital, is less funded. The easy answer to your question is there's a lot to play for. In most countries, the whole point of social care, I think, is reaching a tipping point or a point of inflection in terms of the age problem that we're dealing with. And the global population is due to peak in 2050. In Western Europe and parts of the US and Japan point already. So we are kind of on a decline phase where populations are growing older, and as a population, we are probably on the verge of starting to shrink. What that means is that there's this massive pressure on looking after people for which we don't typically, in most countries, enough resources or skills or even people. And yet, the way social care is currently structured is incredibly manual, only in bits and pieces being digitized as we speak. But that digitization is what you would call phase one digitization, which means we're replicating the manual processes. And so the whole idea of, take IoT and being able to manage people's well-being through sensors is something that we're kind of scratching the surface on right now. That picture we think is incredibly valuable. So we've kind of, as TCS, this has been almost a passion project of mine over the last 12, 18 months, of the idea that we could actually change how care is delivered. And we're not talking about healthcare, but just looking after people who may not have a medical need, but just to keep an eye on an aging relative or people that we are caring for professionally or personally. But if I start with that as kind of a narrow end of the spectrum, I think that opens up the door to really rethinking the entirety of social care, because we know that every kind of a pound or dollar or euro spent on social care, keeping people healthy, will pay back 3 to 5 times at least in the short to medium term in terms of the healthcare cost downstream. So there's a massive economic benefit for governments as well. But obviously it leads to better quality of life, it be better peace of mind, and a far more effective use of technology. And just a small aside is that we've all been working on things like connected home for, I don't know, 10 years or more. The question is always around, is it a solution in search of a problem? Who needs a smart kettle or a smart light bulb, etc.? But it turns out that I think social care can be the killer app for
exactly
the broad set of technologies that we call connected home. And we're seeing that now sort of, there are lots of startups in that space and quite a few that are doing that. But I think how to scale that, how to make it work in a way that it truly transforms care is the next big challenge.
If you call it ambient assisted living, and the idea of using passive sensors to keep an eye on elderly and vulnerable people in their homes, allowing them to stay in their homes longer, not move into care homes, and also be able to leave hospital earlier while they're recuperating from operations and falls and so on. I think there's huge potential, and I think you're right. That probably is the killer app for smart home technology.
The one thing I think we should get better at doing now is observing human behavior, because for a number of situations we're kind of out of sorts in terms of where we are. That should give us a chance to observe what's happened. And your point about some of the connected homes and the smart building. I had a fascinating conversation with the architects of the Edge building in Amsterdam. Both talked about the version of smart cities or smart buildings before versus the one that we now think it is. And he said totally differently. He said, yeah, we need to rethink our approach. And Andy, because one thing that fascinates me is what IBM have been doing regarding maritime and the Mayflower project. Could you kind of give the listeners a bit of an update? Because what we're really looking at is how IBM is creating the machine that's augmenting the human.
The Mayflower Autonomous Ship Project, very exciting project to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the original Mayflower crossing of the Atlantic from Plymouth, UK to Plymouth, Massachusetts, starting in September 400 years ago. What we're doing is we're working with a number of companies who are building an autonomous ship made out of aluminium. The purpose of it is a data gathering vessel. So it's going to go out and do marine research using a number of experiments that are on board the ship. Part that IBM's contributing technology and know-how and research to is the AI Captain, which is the piece of software that's in charge of the boat, completely commanding it. It's not remotely. It's not one of these remote control satellite vision things. This is completely autonomous. It's completely on its own once it's out of the harbour and sailing. And it's a really interesting mix of AI, optimization, and rules-based logic, all working together to make decisions that the AI Captain has to make, particularly implementing the collision regulations, which are the rules of the road for the sea, so it doesn't do anything it's not supposed to do or not allowed to do. And the proposed route from the AI Captain is passed through a piece of cold hard logic called Operational Decision Manager, which says whether you're allowed to, for example, go in front of a boat or should go behind it. It updates the route that the AI captain's proposed and says, right, this is what you're allowed to do, go off and do it. Bringing in weather forecast data as well, so that we can avoid storms and also navigate around local weather conditions from getting data from the weather company sent in by satellite. This is a really, really interesting data fusion problem using machine vision and lots of AI stuff, as I say, with this big optimizer sitting in the middle of it all.
As you were talking, it's a fascinating project, and anyone listening, I'm sure we can put some kind of links on the post of this.
Mas400.com is the MAS400.com is the weather is the portal for all the data from the ship and the operational stuff.
Head there, absolutely. One of the things that we're beginning to also learn, I think, is how we can learn where we could repurpose, and this, recombining technology. And I was thinking a lot of what Andy talked about, and then I talked about social care, and I'm thinking about specifics, people with dementia and smart TVs. You can only buy a smart TV, I guess, nowadays, and families are buying smart TVs for their elderly loved ones. But if they are a dementia sufferer, then the smart TV just is not a device that works. So, are we at a pivot moment where industries like the smart manufacturers now need to understand the human behavior much more than ever before? Do you agree with that?
I think you've just opened a can of worms there. I'm going to be politically incorrect. So I think that you're absolutely right, first of all. I think that the idea that you can repurpose, there is a giant screen that people are familiar with, comfortable with, and the fact that that should be a primary mode of delivering a whole bunch of services. For us, it seems quite natural, but I do want to take you back maybe 5-7 years when IP television was all the craze. And I've spoken to any number of IPTV providers and said, well, shouldn't you be thinking about delivering healthcare or e-commerce? Because IP television providers coming off telecom background would see beyond becoming a TV provider. What has happened in IPTV, you've just created another way of delivering content and probably not as efficient as broadcast television already.
Exactly, yes.
And I think it's because most telecom companies went out and hired television executives to build out their IPTV capabilities because that was the pain point for them. But as a result, I think that opportunity still remains. And you would think, the television screen could be the one screen to rule them all model, where someone who is familiar with that screen can use it for healthcare, for shopping, for communications, for talking to friends and family. Technically, that problem is I wouldn't say trivial one, but certainly is not the most complicated one to solve. But I think imagination is holding us back a little bit, and business systems, certainly hardwired in certain ways, probably prevented us from doing that. In essence, what you said is something I wholeheartedly agree with. We absolutely should be thinking about how we can use the television better. I mean, there are startups now doing that. I'm talking to one of them as we speak.
I think I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one. The format for most people's tellies is to put a massive TV on the wall and then sit quite a long way back and look at it. So if you're going to have an interactive conversation with somebody, that's not really the same as sitting up close and personal with your laptop like we are here. And if you're going to have a consultation with your doctor, you don't want to be sort of sitting in your armchair chatting across the room. The tablet or the phone, it's actually going to leapfrog the TV, because I think they've missed the opportunity, because for exactly the reason you pointed out, they stuck to the we have a hammer, give me some nails problem of broadcast TV. Because TVs didn't grow up with microphones and keyboards and mices, then I think they're going to miss out on that telecare opportunity, which is really sad, because I mean, it's all those pixels there which are effectively going to waste.
One thing that really intrigues me about this subject, and I think in a way it kind of expands out, is this conversation. I think about cookies in our browsers that, obviously remember, websites that we've been to. And, in one particular case, my father-in-law, he has dementia. So he's forgotten that he likes to watch snooker, but the TV set absolutely will know that he watches a lot of snooker.
Right.
So in one respect, you kind of think, well, yeah, let's just connect that dot, because that gives him what he wants, and they know that. And therefore, what would that mean if we could remember? And it starts to get your juices going about what it could be, because it's nothing new that we need to invent. I don't think we just need to connect some things that are already there.
Yeah, and I think that probably already happens with things like the set-top boxes that all your content comes through. They do observe which genres you frequently watch and will then make recommendations based on that. So, types of films or actually cookery programs or whatever it is will come up more often at the top of the list than the other ones. I think you're absolutely right. There's no reason why you shouldn't turn on television, and if there's a whole load of things to choose from, show me first the thing I'm most likely to want to be watching.
If I push that button a little bit further, I think there are lots of learned behaviors. We apparently learn quite quickly. I mean, this whole idea of working on video conference is something that kind of we've all taken to like ducks to water in a way over the last 12 months. So I do believe that we're probably still maybe burdened by our legacy of that's a TV and this is a laptop screen. But if I was to start with a clean slate, maybe, given that we are in a world where everything has a bit of intelligence in there, you may have a little bit of smart furniture that can charge your phone, and you could almost think of a screen. Isn't a traditional television, isn't a laptop, but it's the easiest screen that can be used to talk to your grandkids, talk to your doctor, or sit back and watch, a show on, or who knows, do something else.
Right, it's your interaction screen, of which one-way broadcast might just be a subset of the things you use it for.
Absolutely.
Right. As we move along, one thing that's starting to fascinate is also about digital records. And, that's uppermost in mind when we think about vaccine. I'm intrigued to know whether the application I have on my phone, which is where I can order my medication from, on this patient access app, I'm intrigued to know that when I get my vaccine jab, that it will appear there. And what does that mean for me? Does it allow me to go on an airplane? Those sort of things. So, in terms of digital records, because that's got a huge subject as well. Have we seen anything recently? I know IBM is doing a lot around digital health pass. Andy, you might want to talk to as well. But, this kind of digitizing our record as a proof of our state, well, I think will increase more so now we've gone through COVID. I'll leave it open. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, I'd just like to mention TradeLens, because that's, although it's not the healthcare one, it's the one for international shipping, for container shipping, which is a blockchain-based solution which Maersk and IBM have built between them. It's now a separate company, and a huge percentage of the world's containers go through this system, deals with all the bills of lading and the customs and excise paperwork that has to be done when a container ship enters a port. Up until this solution was created a few years ago, everything was literally on paper. When I say paperwork, I mean literally paperwork. And this has digitized it, and it was not so much the cleverness of the blockchain and the processes behind it, but it's the fact that for the first time ever, this stuff's been digital. It's taken billions of dollars out of the supply chain for moving container ships around the place, and there's absolutely no reason at all why those same principles can't be used for, as you say, proving that you're healthy enough to go on a plane or allowed into a restaurant, or goodness knows where this will end, or indeed if it'll ever start. But I think the capability will be there. I think we'll just have to decide how, as a society, we're going to use it.
If you think about the world of healthcare, it wasn't long ago that we were very much in the world of paper-based records in health as well. And it's only so that we've kind of collectively switched over to electronic health records, and we're seeing the benefit of that. But going back to my earlier point, care is still very much paper-based. You may have 5 people going in to look after an elderly person, all representing medical or voluntary organizations, and they're probably not sharing information at this point. Maybe they're sharing Post-it notes on the wall, right? So it is very, very much, the need of the hour. I'm pretty sure we will see much, much better record keeping. I think that leads us to the next challenge of the provenance, which is where blockchain comes in, security of that record, all of those. And so surely blockchain will have a play in more and more of those areas. And there's probably a philosophical point here which always strikes me as being just something to ponder on. When we talk about our data being accessible to an entity like, let's say, the government or NHS or even a Google, who do we mean? Do we mean, do we mind if a machine looks at that data and makes decisions about, who can or cannot read the data? Does that bother us in the same way? Or is it a human being looking at the data that we find more troublesome? And I think these are things we have to think about, because the data is there, and most of our data is out there, and it is perfectly that we are worried about our data. But at some point, if the data is being looked at by a machine to make certain routing decisions of what the data is used for, does that cause us the same level of concern or not? And I think I don't have a ready answer for this, but I do think this is a question we're going to have to address at some point.
And that gets us into this really interesting area of responsible computing, which is sort of the ethical use of data, ethical use of AI, respecting people's privacy, getting informed consent for your use of the data, because most people have no concept of what can be done with their data these days. And so they just say yes to sign away terms of service, and then who knows what happens to their data. The example you gave of machines looking at our personal information rather than humans, it opens a huge can of worms in terms of the biases inherent in AI systems, which are completely unintentional, just because the historical data they're trained on is flawed decisions that humans made in the past. The computer and say, oh, it'll be okay now, we've handed it over to an AI. No, it just learned everything that you taught it. Huge interest in that area, and we're sort of establishing a community of people who are interested in responsible computing to kind of take this by the horns and really sort of lead by example.
On the bias, if I may, again, I'm just putting a thought out. Please, I'd love to hear what you think about it, Andy and Paul. Exactly what you said, that the bias that we kind of all are concerned about is actually the result of years, decades of human bias in decision making. So are we in danger of kind of shooting the messenger? Isn't it easier to fix the bias in AI because we can see it, we can tinker with it, we can kind of reset the dials a little bit, and it's much harder to fix the human bias. So if we kind of go back to saying, AI doesn't work, we'll stick with humans, we are just shoving it under the carpet because that bias still exists.
Yes and no, because I think that one person's bias is another man's good attribute. So there'll be endless debate as to whether that was a bias, and indeed whether it was a bad bias. It might be that you fully intended to give cheaper car insurance to women because they drive more safely. So it's not sexist that you give cheaper insurance to women. It's just a matter of fact. So I think that opens a whole philosophical debate about what the nature of bias is and whether they're good or bad ones, and therefore to what extent they should be eliminated.
My wife just bought a car from Volvo, but only recently that Volvo realized that the design of the car was not equal for men and women because of the steering wheel and the airbag and all of the protection was biased against women because the crash test dummy was in fact the shape of a man. And that was only in this century that they kind of realized this. So one of the areas I know we want to bring out, which is smart cities, or I suppose smart environments. I mentioned smart before, and is there a new version? Is it smart.2, 2.0? And now I hear Barcelona, because of the traffic congestion, are really trying to revisit this idea of removing cars and finding green spaces and focusing back on the human.
I think, first of all, the same thing we said about smart homes also applies here. There's an enormous amount of technology capability that we have today. It's really pointing it at the right problems, perhaps recognizing which ones we want to solve. Cities are more complex in that they're systems, so you can't be too narrow and say we're just going to go after this one, because the interlinkages, externalities, unintended consequences are much bigger. But having said that, I think what the pandemic has done is it's given us a really interesting dichotomy here, because on the one hand, you hear about the fact that cities are hollowing out because as we move to e-commerce, the high street's kind of becoming irrelevant, and therefore people might as well live outside the city because people don't have to commute anymore. And cities have largely been historically, they've been given quite a bad rap for being kind of centers of congestion and perhaps not the most optimal living. Cities are actually incredibly efficient use of resources. It's much better for the planet in a way for people to be kind of living more densely, because then you're allocating resources much more efficiently. But also we know that cities form the dense networks out of which ideas happen. So from an innovation perspective and perhaps from a sustainability perspective, that dense living is actually quite a good thing for the planet. So we've got this kind of, and maybe the answer is in not treating it again as saying, well, do I live in a city and commute and bear up with all the problems, or do I just move to the country? Maybe the way to look at it is, how do we bring the good things about living outside the city back into the city? And that goes back to how do we create green spaces? How do we reduce, commuting and gridlock and congestion? And I think the technologies that we have today allow us to do that. And that'll probably require slightly more creative thinking around autonomous vehicles, not just replacing cars and buses as we know them with autonomous versions of the same things, but perhaps rethinking urban infrastructure and smart transport to do different things autonomously, to look at deliveries as being last mile autonomous deliveries, whether that's drones or others. So that combination of multiple different systems will probably take us to a different space.
I've tended to come from a bottom-up approach to smart cities rather than a top-down one, on the grounds that you don't very often get the opportunity to design a smart city from scratch. But what we've tended to find is that if you have individual infrastructure projects which just happen to be in the same geographic locality, and you, wherever possible, share resources and interlink them, then you eventually get a sort of whole is greater than the sum of the parts type effect. And you can say, actually, this is quite a smart city, isn't it? And you've done it by accident rather than by design. And I've found that those projects tend to be more successful. They can have the same outcome as you've just described, but just a different approach to how you actually tackle them.
Absolutely, and there's probably like any number of specific problems, as I said, you can go after. I mean, for me, my personal bugbear is, I should be able to, in London, address where can I park around it. That is available. It should basically say, within half a mile of that, there are these 10 parking spots. And if you extend that, then bear with me, this is a thought experiment. Every point in the city is theoretically a parking spot with a price point. So depending on the time of day and the needs, you can actually vary the price to control demand and supply. If you're willing to pay £3,000 an hour, you can probably park on Oxford Street. And I guess what I'm saying is technology today allows us to be that fluid, that analog with parking, saying this is where parking ends and this is where you paid £5 and then this bit is free. And we can probably be cleverer about that.
Because of the kind of mobile phone data that, people have now analyzed that one of the most recent terrorist attacks in London, when it was on a bridge, that, at another time of the day, there'd probably be more fatalities because there was, a percentage more people likely to have been walking along that bridge at that time. So I think people are now, very early days, beginning to build context into the data around cities. And I think that's got to be good, because that will now, whether it's your example of parking or something else will come. Ved, I wanted to move to a question that, a startup kind of mentality inside your world at TCS, in terms of creating innovation, creating some ideas, creating some buzz, and then kind of moving it into sort of, mainstream. So design thinking, system thinking, we've touched on. Is there something you could say about, your hopes for the future around that for TCS and yourself?
The magic, I think, happens when you bring these components together. I think design thinking is fundamental because design thinking gets us out of our own biases and our own lens. And really, it's all about obviously using empathy and kind of forcing you to be empathetic by looking at the problem through the user's eyes. You sit with the user, you understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, and you come up with a whole bunch of insights that you may not have gone in with. Yeah, but I think that design thinking is sometimes used as a substitute for innovation, and they're not really. So I think design thinking is an incredibly important tool, but that needs to be coupled with technology research as another important tool. Neither by itself will give you the outcomes that you want, but we have to be able to bring these together. Because, again, if I was to be provocative, I would products typically come from technology research, but they need design thinking to give them the kind of mass appeal and usability without which they would, forever live in the lab.
10, 15 years ago, someone pointed out it'd be a really good idea to ask the people who might use our products what they wanted, rather than design them and hope that they would, with the novel insight that if you've asked at least one person what they want and you make it, they'll probably buy it, and probably more people will as well. So the whole sort of outside-in design, customer-centric design, Ford's strapline of everything we do is driven by you, that kind of era has turned into a formalization of that methodology of which we call design thinking, which takes into account, as Ved said, things like personas and putting yourself in a person's shoes for a day, and it's incredibly useful. And if you link that with agile development, so that you can test what you've built incrementally with those users to say, is this what you wanted? And they normally go, well, it was what I asked for, but actually now you've shown it to me, it's not really what I wanted. You start to understand the sort of the frailty of the human mind here in not really being able to articulate what we actually want. So a combination of asking the people who are going to use it and developing it incrementally in an agile fashion actually leads to products that people want, that are really well designed and which sell in quantity, which is of course what we really want.
I can recall someone who used to tease me when I joined the kind of tech industry, and they've been my peer really, when he talked about the trouble is with you guys, you're very good at building vitamins, things that people should want but actually don't use. What you're not very good at is building painkillers, things that people need and it stuck me all the way through it. But then I equally know that we've built some amazing vitamins that have become painkillers because situations change. I mean, we talked about blockchain and been around for a long, long time, but we've now joined it together to create TraceLens, which maybe, we didn't have the opportunity 5-10 years ago because the environment wasn't the same. Last couple of minutes, guys. I mean, I wanted to ask you both, the kind of vision for the future, but I think you gave me that at the start. So, Ved, is there a question that you think we should have asked you that we haven't?
When you're in pain, the last thing you want is someone telling you, have the vitamins, and in about 3 weeks' time, you'll feel better. So painkillers,
absolutely,
long-lived painkillers. But to your question, I think for me, one of the interesting things that struck me almost in the last few days is that we've had this really incredible experience in the last 12 months of, if you look at the way the vaccination process worked, here is a scenario where globally we've been able to conceptualize a product from scratch, design it, research it, build it, test it, put it through a regulatory process, produce it in billions, or we're in the process of, with machinery that probably didn't exist for it, and consume it all within the space of 2 years. I think that's a fabulous achievement, once we've gone through that process. And to think of that as the realm of possibilities suggests that when push comes to shove, we can actually do these kinds of things. It would be great to see a similar level of urgency being applied to some of the other pressing problems in the world. So, you've got inequality, economic inequality, you've got environment, you've got education, and a broader health challenge. It would be phenomenal if we could kind of see a world where this level of capability was available to us to use for any of those problems.
And Andy?
Well, I think the one thing that's really been brought home for me in the last 12 months is how adaptable we are to change. The transformations that have been started forced upon us by the pandemic. I mean, I've got this lovely cartoon, which I tend to show, which was your digital transformation driven by the CEO, the CIO, or COVID virus, and it's tick the last one. People have been doing, oh yeah, we should move to such and such, or we should start doing so and so. Been saying this for decades, but now this year, they've done it really, really quickly. And I think the genie's out of the bottle there, so those things aren't coming back. And if you link that with some fairly fundamental changes in the way we do business and interact with people, I think the future for cloud-based AI solutions to fuel digital transformation and streamlining of the efficiencies of organizations is here with us to stay. So this is really exciting, beginning of a really exciting future.
Andy, thank you so much. My colleagues supporting me on the podcast. Your insight and the stories are brilliant. And Ved, especially for you, big thanks for your contribution and your insight and a glimpse into the world of your role at TCS. So thank you so much, Ved.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Ved. It was great talking to you.
And to the listeners of AI Talk, though, thank you very much.